Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our 8th Coastal Connections workshop. The theme for today is tourism and visitor management. It's the latest in our series of international workshops where we're showcasing examples of how coastal heritage sites are addressing the impacts of climate change. I'm Director Alex Kent. It's my privilege to lead the Coastal Connections project. Many of you have been involved with this already, which is fantastic. And it's a joint initiative, in case you don't know, between World Monuments Fund and English Heritage to build a global network for sharing knowledge, experience and practical solutions amongst those who manage or care for coastal heritage. So far, we've had over 40 sites join the Coastal Connections global network. So if you manage or care for a particular site and would like to join us, please get in touch through our website or you can email me directly. Just a bit of information about World Monuments Fund and obviously English Heritage too. Headquartered in New York, World Monuments Fund is the leading independent organisation devoted to safeguarding the world's most treasured places to enrich people's lives and bring mutual understanding across cultures and communities. With affiliate offices in other countries, including the UK, where Coastal Connections, this project is based. It's been involved in over 800 heritage conservation projects since it was founded in 1965. English Heritage is a charity that cares for over 400 sites and their collections in England for the benefit of this and future generations. Its work is informed by the values of authenticity, quality, imagination, responsibility and fun, and its vision is that people will experience the story of England where it really happened. Now, as usual, we really like to know where people are joining us from. So if you want to, please feel free to say hello in the chat and say where, especially if you manage a coastal heritage site. It'd be great to know where you're coming from today or tuning in from. I want to thank, before we get underway, everyone who completed our questionnaire about Coastal Connections. That's the first one and the evaluation. We've identified a few more themes for this next series of workshops. So tourism and visitor management, which is the first of these, assessing risk and vulnerability, that'll be the next workshop, and then underwater and intertidal heritage. That's another topic that we'll focus on in the new year. But there are plenty of other good suggestions too, so that's fantastic, and hopefully we'll look at some of those a little bit later. So today's workshop will kick off this series that will then conclude the first phase of Coastal Connections next spring. And by that time, we will have had 10 workshops, all of which have been recorded, the first 7 of which that we had before the summer or the winter, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Those workshop recordings are already up on the website. And looking ahead to the future, what we're planning to do is focus on specific regions for the next phase of Coastal Connections and then share some of the innovative solutions more broadly with the global workshops. But I'll say more about that in due course as we progress later through into the series. So for today then, let's just crack back onto where we are at the moment. We'll hear from our range of excellent speakers first, and then we'll have a brief Q&A session of probably about 10 minutes, and then we'll discuss the topic in breakout rooms that my colleague Kira will organise. So what I'm going to do next then, without further ado, is hand over to my colleague Stephanie Ortiz, who's the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at World Monuments Fund, based in New York. And she's then going to kindly introduce today's theme for us, which again is tourism and visitor management. So thank you, Stephanie. Great to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to provide a brief introduction to today's discussion on how climate change is affecting tourism of coastal heritage sites. And so if I can have the next slide, I'll dive right in. So as many of you know, heritage and tourism have a reciprocal relationship. Cultural heritage sites drive tourism by attracting visitors and generating revenue that is crucial for preservation efforts. Coastal tourism is the largest component of the global tourism industry. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, more than 60% of Europeans choose beach holidays, and coastal tourism accounts for more than 80% of United States tourism revenue. So coastal heritage sites often depend highly on tourism. However, poorly managed tourism can cause irreversible damage, including overvisitation, misuse, and exclusion of local stakeholders. Climate change further compounds these challenges impacting both the preservation of heritage sites and the tourism industry that often sustains them. Next slide, please. So for some of the key impacts of climate change on coastal heritage tourism, we have rising sea levels, so coastal flooding and shoreline erosion are severe threats. For instance, a 1 meter rise in the sea level could inundate up to 60% of tourist resorts in the Caribbean, endangering both the historic coastal cities and modern tourism infrastructure. And to note that in the Caribbean, it's in Greater Caribbean, so counting also some of the countries along the Caribbean Sea in South America and Central America, most of the historic cities that are also the country's capitals are actual coastal cities. So that definitely is a major threat. Extreme weather events, so increased heat waves pose a health risk for visitors, and more intense droughts followed by heavy rains can lead to soil saturation and landslides. Hurricanes are also becoming more intense and less predictable, impacting both heritage sites, resilience, and tourism economies dependent on stable seasons. Rising temperatures and warmer climates impact biodiversity, affecting the natural appeal of coastal areas. In the Caribbean, for example, and I keep referring to the Caribbean because I'm from Puerto Rico originally, which is pictured here. In the Caribbean, we have the sargassum blooms that are impacting both the scenic beauty, the ecosystem, and it also definitely impacts tourist visitation to some of these areas. And the modes of impact, climate change affects coastal heritage in two main ways. There's the gradual changes that we see little by little. It's temperature fluctuations and shifting wet-dry patterns. They contribute to slow but ongoing material degradation at these sites. And then you have the sudden events, the extreme weather events like hurricanes, floods that can cause rapid destruction. The impacts are felt across various levels. So you have the physical condition of the heritage sites, you have the site operations and visitor safety, the tourism industry and visitor experience, and you also have local cultural identity, as traditional practices are lost or altered by these impacts. And so as someone who grew up in Puerto Rico, I find it very heartbreaking to see beaches that I love and that I frequented as a child and through most of my life suddenly disappear after storms like Maria. So next slide. Because I'm keeping it brief, I'll just demonstrate two projects that the World Monuments Fund is working on that have some relation to this. So you have Rapa Nui National Park in the island of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. Rapa Nui's coastal heritage is highly vulnerable to sea level rise, to stronger storm surges, and to shifting wind patterns. These changes increase erosion, especially in fragile materials like volcanic tuff, which is the material that the moai, the iconic monument that we associate with Easter Island, the Rapa Nui, is made of. The moai and the petroglyphs are vulnerable to this. Additionally, extreme wind events at sites like Corongo, and that's the site that's pictured on the left. These extreme wind events necessitate more frequent closures to protect visitors' safety. So that's one of the ways that the site administrators are dealing with this kind of shifting climate. The site itself is closed, and then you rely also on the visitor center, the site museum, the interpretation area. You rely on that most for the visitor experience instead of just looking at the site. Next slide. And then we have in South America also, we have the Teyuna Ciudad Perdida Archaeological Park. Ciudad Perdida is in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in Colombia. It's one of the world's tallest coastal mountain ranges. It's located in Colombia's Caribbean coast. And the site was built many hundreds of years ago by the Tairona culture, and the Tairona masterfully built these structures to manage the characteristic rainfall of the region, allowing the walls to withstand the late day rain, which then evaporated the following morning. So the buildings themselves are built in a way to adapt to this. to the specific climate. However, the changing patterns of precipitation and evaporation and growing visitor numbers at Ciudad Perdida, they have disrupted this cycle. And so it tends to concentrate moisture at the structures that then bear the weight of more tourism, more tourists that come earlier and earlier in the day to avoid excess heat in the middle of the day or later in the afternoon. And so this poses an important challenge and considerations for the conservation interventions, but also for visitor management strategies at the site, such as redirecting visitation to disperse people, closing sections to allow the site to rest, and also putting a cap on the number of visitors at a particular time. And so to close out this session, as we continue with today's discussions on managing tourism and climate impacts at coastal heritage sites, I'd just like to pose a few questions for reflection, if I may. So what sets coastal heritage sites apart from other types of heritage regarding the vulnerability to climate impacts? Also, what are some of the strategies being implemented by site managers of coastal heritage sites to protect the sites themselves and to maintain tourism viability? And I also think it's important to consider the reality that not every site or every country has the same ability to bounce back or to adapt and mitigate these challenges to diversify their economies. And so with that, I end. Back to you, Alex.
Lovely. Thanks ever so much, Stephanie. That was a fantastic and really thought-provoking introduction that really nicely frames not just the breadth of issues that we're dealing with in relation to tourism, visitor management and climate change, but also I think the really important point that obviously no two sites perhaps can apply exactly the same strategy and approach, given that every site is unique and the resources that are available, of course, to manage tourism is going to be different given obviously the different conditions that we find ourselves in. So that's really, really valuable. We don't want to advocate a one size fits all, of course, everywhere. So thank you for that. And I think what we will start to see as we now listen to the different speakers and the case studies that we have in front of us is, of course, that variety, not just in the challenges that they face, but obviously also in the solutions. But again, thank you, Stephanie. That's a brilliant introduction. Exactly frames it ever so nicely for us. So thank you. So let's now move to Will Boyd-Wallis, our first speaker. And just to introduce Will, who is has been the West Highlands Operations Manager for the National Trust for Scotland for 3 years. He oversees management of several important coastal sites in that region, including Torridon, Balmacara, Iona, Stafford National Nature Reserve, Berg, Treshness Isles, St Kilda National Nature Reserve and World Heritage Site, Mingulay, Pabay and Berneray. And I'm sure that many of you listening will be familiar with some of these locations, but we're particularly keen to hear what Will has to say about some of these sites, particularly Stafford, where I was with Will earlier this summer. Unfortunately, we had some really excellent weather, but I gather that is not always the case. So over to you, Will, and thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. I hope you can all hear me. Nod if you can.
Yep, that's good.
Oh, yeah, good. I'm going to pretend I'm in front of a lectern and a big audience of people. It's quite bizarre, isn't it, doing it like this? But it's great to know that there's lots of people out there from all around the place. I've been seeing faces pop up, so it's wonderful. Thanks, Alex. You saved me the first bit of my talk introducing myself, so that's good. But just to say, yeah, I've been with National Trust for Scotland for 3 years, and as Alex said, some wonderful places that I'm involved with. And we've got Susan Bain here as well, who manages St Kilda. So that's great. I'm sure she'll be inputting later on. But what I wanted to do today was focus on 3 particular islands that we manage. One is St Kilda in the top left there, and then the Treshness Isles and Stafford. And Treshness and Stafford are just west of the Isle of Mull. But the National Trust for Scotland, just so you know, if those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's Scotland's largest conservation charity, and we look after nature, beauty and heritage for everyone. And we have been doing that since 1931. And that includes mountains, monuments, coastlines, as we've said, churches, houses, you name it. So next slide, please. Kira. Thanks. I wanted to start with the puffin because the puffin is a symbol of all of the islands, and it's a figurehead in many ways, and it's something that draws visitors from all over the world to see them on the west coast of Scotland. It's a huge draw, and it's immediately recognisable and loved by everyone. But puffins, like a lot of seabirds, are very much threatened by climate change. Sea temperature rises are affecting the food sources that they have. Of course, overfishing and things like that are making this even worse. But disease is also becoming a bigger issue, with avian flu being very apparent in the last few years. So the puffin is very vulnerable, and yet it's one of our biggest draws for tourism. Not only in the landscape, but the wildlife is a huge draw. So, and I put in the stripes, the climate stripes below, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. They were devised by Ed Hawkins from University of Reading in 2018, and they show how the global average temperatures have risen over the last 2 centuries. And I thought the stripes were very reminiscent of the beak of the puffin, actually. So it's not only a symbol of the islands, it's also a stark reminder of the challenge we have with climate change. So next slide, please, Kira. And so sticking with the seabirds on all of the islands, the fulmar there, that bird you see in the slide, that was taken on St Kilda. We have a huge variety of seabirds, and St Kilda is one of the biggest strongholds of seabirds. And the fulmar was a vital food source and a source of all sorts of materials, leather and the stomach contents were used for all sorts of things. But before St Kilda was evacuated in 1930, so it was a hugely important bird for the population on St Kilda. But all of our seabirds are threatened by climate change, as I mentioned, disease, but also invasive predators such as rats. And Rachel there on the top right is holding out a wax block where we're using wax blocks to monitor whether or not rats have got onto the islands. I'm sure this is used by a number of you here today, but it's a way of monitoring and being vigilant to see whether or not we might have invasive predators like rats, which would be an absolute disaster on these islands. So we're constantly on the lookout for that, and we're trying to raise awareness of the need for biosecurity on all of our islands. With the huge numbers of visitors that we get, that can be quite challenging. So that's critical for us as we go forward. And the last picture there, the hand holding a Leach's storm petrel chick. We're doing a lot of research on St Kilda with our seabird ranger there, and across all of our sites to monitor the effects of climate change and the effects of predation and the effects on all of the species that are there, to see, to learn what we can do to counter any threats that they're dealing with. So next slide, please, Kira. So the first of the islands I'm going to take you to is the island of Staffa, which is a national nature reserve, and it's very famous for this cave you can see on the right here, Fingal's Cave. And it's also famous for the puffins. I mean, all over the island of Mull and Oban and further afield, there are buses with puffins on the side, and puffins are just everywhere. They're advertised to draw the visitors. So people come not just for this incredible geology and incredible landscape, but they also come for the wildlife. And so we have to, in our role as owner of Staffa and in our role as a conservation charity, we have to manage that. We manage the huge numbers of visitors. Staffa gets approximately up to 100,000 visitors every year, and it's only a mile and a half long. It's a very small island, but it gets very, very busy some days in the summer. So we need to manage that. The puffins on the top of the island are very vulnerable to disturbance. So that's a really key aspect of what we're trying to do there. Is we have rangers on Staffa and on all of our islands who meet with the visitors and talk to them, as I mentioned, about biosecurity, but also talk to them about what they should and shouldn't do in order to avoid disturbing wildlife and impacting them. But on top of that, we've also, on all of the islands, have infrastructure that we have to manage, and people can walk right into the cave there And there's actually concrete steps to the right, which on some years after storms can get quite significantly damaged. A couple of years ago, an entire side of the step got washed away. So it's very complex doing this maintenance and managing the damage that is becoming increasingly an issue for us. So there's that infrastructure, and as well as the cave entrance there's a concrete jetty and a staircase and there's footpaths on the top. So next slide, please, Kira. So people arrive to Stafford on a number of local boats. There's boat operators locally, 3 main local boat operators, and they're private independent businesses not connected to the National Trust for Scotland. And they depend on taking people out to Stafford for their businesses. And as I said, 100,000 odd people a year, all being charged £40 a time. I think they do pretty well out of it, but it's a big employer locally, so it's a really, really important business locally as well. So we have a sort of moral duty as well to keep the islands open and accessible. And so I put this picture in because the jetty there that you can see people queuing up along is tidal, obviously, and at high tides they can only access the top bit on the right. That jetty is proving not big enough because at sometimes of the year it can get very, very busy and congested and potentially dangerous for people. So we've got plans at the moment to expand that jetty, and in the top left there you can see some guys are in there right at this moment working on widening the jetty at the top end and raising it up a little bit. But that's extremely challenging work. First of all, because we can't do it in the summer months when the weather's best and the days are longest. We have to do it in the winter because in the summertime, there's a cave just to the right of the jetty there. There's nesting birds, and we mustn't disturb them by law. They're protected, and so we don't want to disturb them. But also in the summer months, to do the jetty work would mean closing the jetty, and so those boat businesses wouldn't be able to operate. So we took the decision to do the work in the winter, which in hindsight may have been a mistake because it's proving to be extremely difficult. As you can see in the top right there, that's what the jetty looks like on a relatively calm day at high tide. And we had Storm Ashley a few weeks ago, which destroyed that scaffolding that you can see in the picture on the top right, washed it into the sea, and of course then that had to be brought in. So we're finding, it's very, very difficult, and the weather is extremely unpredictable and difficult for us. And I think that is something that we are finding more and more at the moment as a result of climate change. So could we have the next slide, please, Kieran?
A couple of minutes left, Will. Okay.
Okay, I'll try and whiz through. So this is Lunga, and it's on the Treshnish Isles, which is quite near to Stafford, so you can whiz through that one if you like. Next slide, thanks. So on Lunga, we have a huge populations of birds, guillemots and razorbills. Oh, if you just go back one more. So here on Lunga, on the top left there, you can see an area, I hope it's not too small, but there's an area of grass that's well trampled and looks like a bowling green. That surrounds an area where the puffins breed. And so people visiting this can get very, very close to puffins and have an amazing experience. But the trouble with that is that quite a lot of people were sort of walking in amongst their burrows and potentially crushing the burrows and also getting too close to the birds and potentially passing on disease. But there is a positive in that they actually deter predators, the blackback gulls and the great skewer from the puffins as well. However, it needed to be managed, so we brought in a ranger service and we brought in a very discreet blue rope that runs along the ground, and that helps keep the people back from the puffins. And research has shown that that's worked extremely well. They still have a fantastic experience, but they're kept back from the puffins. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so St Kilda, the final site. This is a dual World Heritage Site on account of its wonderful natural heritage. It's got huge seabird populations, hundreds of thousands of gannets in particular. It's one of only 39 dual World Heritage sites in the world, and its other status is because of the incredible archaeology. It's been occupied for thousands of years until 1930 when it was evacuated. I haven't got time to go into how incredible St Kilda is, but I'm sure it's well known to a lot of you. We've got a ranger on site, an archaeologist, and a seabird officer. They're through the summer, but all through the winter, there's the MOD base, and we work very closely with them. So next slide, please. Nearly there, Alex. So finally, I just thought I'd mention that last year we undertook a climate vulnerability index with James Cook University Australia. And that brought in lots of different people, a lot of different people involved in the management of St Kilda, from Nature Scot, from Historic Environment Scotland, and others in the community of the Western Isles. And in summary, what that highlighted was the temperature trend, the storm intensity and frequency, and the changing currents and the impacts that having. It's a fairly low impact on community because there isn't much of a community on St Kilda itself, but it was deemed to have a moderate impact on the vulnerability, and that's because a lot of St Kilda is cliffs, and there's limited areas where it can, storms can cut into the island. However, storms are having an impact, and we have spent huge amount of time every year repairing lots of archaeological sites, dikes and things like that. And so increased rainfall and wind is going to have an impact on that without a doubt. We've just spent a fortune repairing the church roof in the village. So yeah, that is a big issue for us, and that's increasingly a problem. This year we had the worst weather in a summer, I think, on record. I mean, in August, the visitor numbers were down by 16% this year, which was huge. But this August, last year, for example, we had 658 visitors. This year, we had 97. So, and that was largely because of people unable to get to the island because of the weather. And that also means visitors aren't spending in our shop, which is where we do a lot of fundraising to help manage the island. So, and we need that income. Okay, final slide. I just wanted to go back to the stripes just to finish off. This is Sue, our ranger on St Kilda. She likes to get things done, and just basically this is an immovable object, and it's symbolizing climate change for me. It's a reality, it's here to stay, and it's not something we can ignore or push to one side, and we've got to face it, adapt, and manage the consequences in every way that we can. Thanks, folks. I rattle through.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. That was really, really fascinating. And again, really, really interesting to see how even within quite a confined geographical area, we've got different challenges, obviously, that are facing these different islands in different ways. And obviously, again, different reasons why visitors are choosing to see these different places, of course, and how they're treasured to us in different ways, whether they be cultural heritage or natural heritage. So thanks very much indeed, Will. That's great. I will say it's fantastic. We've already got a question in the chat. And if you do have questions that you want to put to our speakers, at the end, we'll address those. So feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and then I'll address those at the end. But let's move on now to, actually not too far away, the other end of the Giant's Causeway. Funny enough, we have one giant who lived in a cave. Is it Ben and Donna at one end, or Fingal rather, at Stafford? And then now we're going to the Giant's Causeway, where Finn McCool, I think, used to hang out. And so this is, in a way, a really interesting coastal connection, let's say, we have between these two sites. Well, let me introduce Kirstin then. Kirstin Lemon holds a PhD in geological science and an MSc in climate change and development, and is currently the science programme manager for Northern Ireland with the British Geological Survey. Kirstin's expertise is in promoting the use of geoscience as a tool to support climate action and sustainable development, which she does internationally, nationally, and locally. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Kirstin, and the significance at all those different scales. So take it away. Thanks very much. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alex. So first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to talk this evening. It's always a pleasure to talk about the Giant's Causeway, and it's really nice that it's come after some of those lovely images from Stafford, because there's lots of lovely geological links. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the Giant's Causeway and the Causeway Coast World Heritage Site. I am not a site manager, but I do sit on the steering group for the Giant's Causeway and the Causeway Coast World Heritage Site one of a number of stakeholders, because there's obviously a number of interested parties that look after and manage the site in various different ways. So if I could have the first slide, please. So just for those of you that aren't aware of where the Giant's Causeway is, we're located on the north coast of County Antrim in Northern Ireland. It's quite a small World Heritage Site, and it is a coastal World Heritage Site. You might be able to see the dark green line, a dashed line that shows the landward boundary of the World Heritage Site, but it also extends into the marine environment as well. If you look on the bottom left-hand side of that map, you'll see that there is a causeway centre. That is the award-winning visitor centre for the Giant's Causeway, opened in 2012. Most visitors to the site start from there, and they will walk down to the Grand Causeway, which is about 1/3 of the way along that map. So they don't actually go very far. But there are a network of around about 10 kilometres of paths along the site, which people will use either across the top of the cliff or at the bottom of the cliff. But if you look to the right-hand side of that map, there's another dashed line that shows the lower cliff path that's been closed since 1994. So whilst most people go to the visitor centre and to the Grand Causeway, the full site is actually quite difficult to access unless you go along the top cliff path, which then links into other walking routes all the way across the Antrim coast. So if you go to the next slide for me, please. So just by way of introduction to the site itself, the Causeway Coast and the Giant's Causeway World Heritage Site, and I've called it its full name for a reason that I'll explain in a moment, is only 2.3 kilometres squared, so it is very small. The National Trust holds most of the land in alienable ownership, with the marine side actually owned by the Crown Estate. The National Trust is responsible for day-to-day operations, so they're responsible for site and visitor management. And then the World Heritage Site Steering Group is the group that provides the framework for the implementation of the management plan, which is the requirement as part of the World Heritage Site status. So could I have the next slide, please? What I wanted to do is to talk a little bit about why the Giant's Causeway and the Causeway Coast is a World Heritage Site. So we were inscribed in 1986. We're the only World Heritage Site in Northern Ireland. And we're one of only, I think, 2 in the whole of the UK that were inscribed because of our geological heritage. So we're inscribed under Criterion 7 and Criterion 8. For any of you that don't know, World Heritage Sites are inscribed either because they've got outstanding universal value for natural heritage or for cultural heritage, or sometimes for both. By far, the majority of World Heritage Sites are inscribed because of their cultural heritage. So out of about 1,200 World Heritage Sites, only about 200 are actually because they're of natural heritage. And an even smaller percentage of that are because of their geology. So we are actually, I'm not going to say unique because I don't believe in that word, but we're certainly very unusual when it comes to World Heritage Sites globally. That status is primarily because of its columnar and its massive basalt that I'll show you a photograph of in a moment. But it's also because the whole coastline shows the record of a sequence of events that occurred around about 65 million years ago that record the opening of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, I know that sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but it's not just looking at the columns, it's looking at the actual coastline as well, which is why I use the full name of the World Heritage Site. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So this is what most people think of when they think of the Giant's Causeway. And yes, that's fine. That is the actual Giant's Causeway. But the World Heritage Site is about so much more than that. You've already seen pictures of Staffa. I can think of dozens of examples where we have columnar basalt all the way around the world. It is not that special. And I say that as a geologist. If you go to the next slide, please. This is actually what's special. So if you see all those different layers that make up the coastline, they each record a different event in the sequence of events that occurred when the Atlantic Ocean was opening around about 65 million years ago. But it's that coastal setting that makes the Giant's Causeway World Heritage Site a bit more difficult to manage, and looking at how those rocks have been formed. So if you go to the next slide, please. So just to talk a little bit about tourism in particular at the Giant's Causeway. The Giant's Causeway is Northern Ireland's #1 tourist attraction. In 2023, we had 663,000 visitors. Now that's still recovering from COVID. We reached a peak in 2017 with 1 million visitors. That is the first time a visitor attraction in Northern Ireland peaked with 1 million visitors. Bear in mind, we only have a population of 1.9 million. So that's over half of our population coming to the country. Before COVID, 78% of the visitors were from overseas, whether that be Canada, the US, Great Britain, or China. But they were predominantly visitors that were from outside Northern Ireland. The Causeway has a significant positive impact on the economy, not just of the local area, but of Northern Ireland as a whole, and generated 500 million for Northern Ireland in 2018. It employs 75 full-time staff that contributes to 3.5 million to the local economy. And the craft and the gift shop, 80% of them are sourced locally. Now that's all fantastic economic figures, but I also have to highlight the cultural significance of the Giant's Causeway. Some of you may have noticed, or you may have not, that the logo for the government department that I work under is actually in the shape of a hexagon. Every single government department in Northern Ireland uses the hexagons from the basalt columns as their shape. You will see hexagons everywhere in Northern Ireland. There are so many things that are called a giant something. It is part of the brand of Northern Ireland. So it is a really, really big part of our tourism offering, of our cultural offering, and everybody has got links with Finn McCool, the giant that supposedly formed the Causeway. But of course, as a geologist, I know it was more to do with volcanoes. But it's just to highlight that's how much of an important aspect of Northern Ireland the Giant's Causeway is. But the visitor pressures that are being created because the significant numbers are getting greater. And whilst the numbers have decreased because of COVID, they are once again increasing. So now is the time for us to reassess how we look at that site. So if you can give me the next slide, please. So a couple of years ago, the Geological Survey undertook a short research study looking at the climate vulnerability of the Giant's Causeway. And I'm glad Will talked about climate vulnerability earlier on, because what we used was the Climate Vulnerability Index as a tool to try and assess what the main climate change stressors were for the Giant's Causeway. Now, we identified 4 instead of the 3 recommended as part of the index, because actually 2 of them were of equal importance. So we identified sea level rise, as you can probably imagine, being at the coast. But we also identified extreme temperature events, precipitation change, and storm intensity and frequency. Now, these were primarily looking at their impact on the outstanding universal value. Now, this is actually really significant because most people, whenever you talk to them about geological heritage, they think that climate change does not have an impact because, let's be honest, the rocks have been there for millions of years. So why are they going to change now? But as a geologist, I can tell you that is not the case at all, because over the last number of years, we've been doing a lot of research to see what the impact of climate change actually will be at the Giant's Causeway, and already is. So with regards to the climate stressors on the screen in front of you, sea level rise was put down as being at extreme risk for obvious reasons. We anticipate that 11 centimetres of sea rise will happen on the north coast of Northern Ireland by 2100, but that could be up to 93 centimetres. That would cover a significant amount of the Causeway itself. The other 3 stressors, however, will have a different type of impact, and they're going to have an impact on the rocks themselves and how they really function and how they respond to those events is something that we've been looking at in a bit more detail. If you give me the next slide, please. So the Giant's Causeway is a dynamic site. It is at the coast, and all sites at the coast are dynamic because they're exposed to the elements, whether it be waves, whether it be lots of storm activity. The Giant's Causeway, however, is sort of gone unnoticed when it comes to looking at these sorts of events. But if you remember the map I showed you earlier on with the path that was closed from 1994, if you look at the bottom of that picture, in the bottom of the left-hand side, you'll see a sub-horizontal line going across. That is the path that is closed. You will see on the right-hand side of that map or that picture that there is significant rockfall. The reason why that path is closed is because of landslides and rockfall activity, and that is ongoing. So that path has been closed for 30 years now. There's no chance of it ever opening because those landslides keep happening. So if you go to the next slide, please. So whilst the path I showed you earlier on has been closed, and it has been for 30 years, this path, this road you're looking at, is not closed. This is the main visitor access to the Grand Causeway. This is where the bus goes. This is where everybody walks down. Just behind you, if you're looking up that path, that's where the main causeway is. But if you look at the left-hand side, there's a lot of rockfall there. And if you could see it properly, the tarmac on that road has actually got pock marks in it from where we have rockfall on the road, leaving massive big holes. So if you want to look at the timing of those events, you can actually look at it with respect to when that road is resurfaced, and you can actually get an idea of how much rockfall there's been on the road. So if you go to the next slide, please. This also has another impact because the network of paths I showed you earlier on, all the walking routes, these are quite frequently closed because of rockfall events, because of landslides. These are just some examples of the different events that have taken place. You'll see that the paths are closed. You'll see that the steps themselves, they have got mudslides beside them. You'll see that there's significant amounts of rockfall. The National Trust records all of these events and has done so since 2010. There's been 300 different events recorded since 2010, and we know that the number of these and the intensity of these is actually increasing. And put that together with climate data, and we're able to see that there is a correlation between these extreme weather events, between intense precipitation events, between that and the amount of rockfall and landslides that we're seeing on the site. So it is having an increasingly large impact. However, it's not something that is widely known about because this is our #1 tourist attraction. This is not something that we communicate widely, but we are monitoring it, and we're working with the National Trust to come up with visitor management plans as to how we look at that site and how we manage the risks associated with that. So if you go on the next slide, please.
A couple of minutes left, Kirstin.
No problem. So this is just a picture of the monitoring. So if you want to flick on to the next slide, I think I've only got a handful more anyway. And then one of the other big visitor issues is to do with coin insertion at the Giant's Causeway. And you're probably thinking, Kirstin, what are you talking about? What is that? The basalt columns that we have at the Giant's Causeway has got lots of joints, both horizontally and vertically. For some bizarre reason, tourists have started to stick coins into these joints. It's seen as being good luck, apparently. Now, this only started probably in the last 10, 15 years, but it is having a significant impact on the accessible areas of the site. There are now thousands of coins being inserted. This has a number of different impacts. Number one, it's got a physical impact because people actually hammer these coins into the joints. They lift another stone and they'll hammer them in. That causes fracturing and disintegration. The other issue we're having is the chemical processes that take place whenever those coins weather. These coins are from all over the world. We've got international visitors. I've mentioned that already. They're from all over the world. They've got different coin compositions. Some of them are quite simple. Some of them are quite complex. If you combine that with the chemical composition of the rocks, if you combine that with increased amounts of precipitation, and you combine that with increased temperature, as well as the saline environment that we're in, it's exacerbating all of the chemical weathering that's taking place at that site. You can see a little bit of the staining that's going on, but it's also having an impact as those coins start to laminate and increase the joints. They will ultimately lead to visitor safety issues because those rocks will fall apart. And at the moment, we're working on a plan to try and see what we can do about this. So we're embarking on a study to try and see what the impact is, and then also to remove these coins, because by removing them, we hope that it will discourage people from doing it in the first place. And that's the stage that we're at. So if you go to my last slide. So one of the things that we've been trying to do as part of the research is to try and look at how the causeway adapts to climate change. There's a lot more work needs done on this, and what I've done is I've broken it down into 3 different types of adaptation based on the categories that the IPCC use. So there's physical adaptation by building retaining walls and rock scaling to contain rockfall and building resilient recreational paths. There's social adaptation that is included in school programs by doing tours about climate change and by the monitoring and research that's being carried out. And then, of course, there's institutional adaptation. A lot of the causeway is protected under various national and local designations, which helps with the management, helps to protect the site. There's also site management plans that we work with the National Trust on. There's also then the World Heritage Site Management Plan that deals with climate change issues, and then the overarching National Trust strategy that has climate change at its very heart. But I do appreciate that a lot of these activities are happening almost by accident, and a lot more work needs to be done. But we are aware of a lot of the issues, where we are embarking upon a full climate vulnerability index study next year. So watch this space, and hopefully next time I'll have a lot more to tell you. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kirstin, that was fantastic. And it's really interesting to see, obviously, not just the physical pressures, let's say, that you're having to deal with, the physical challenges of land size, but also, obviously, given the theme of what we're talking about today, the challenge, the huge challenge you've got in managing the sort of behaviour that you've just illustrated of people actually hammering coins from, people from all around the world hammering coins into the basalt columns. So it'll be really interesting to see, what the solutions will be for that in the next few years, I guess. That'll be really, really quite fascinating. Be interesting to know if anyone listening has got anything or has seen anything similar, perhaps for a site that they manage or know about, of visitors actually engaging in that sort of activity. I think that'll be quite interesting to know. All right, fantastic. Thank you, Kirstin. Now let's move straight on to, or move across the Atlantic to a very different environment. So Andrea is going to be talking about the impacts of climate change and tourism of coastal heritage sites in the Caribbean. And just to give you a little bit of background on Andrea Richards, an archaeologist from the Caribbean, presently working on issues concerning climate-induced and other natural hazards and their impact on Caribbean heritage. She's currently a PhD researcher at Leiden University and a Heritage and Emergencies Specialist with UNESCO, where she supports countries in undertaking post-disaster needs assessments for the culture sector. So you're very welcome, Andrea. It's great to have you with us. And with no further ado, please crack straight on. And if anyone has questions, again, please keep adding them to the chat. Thanks very much indeed. Over to you, Andrea. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, all right then. I'm not seeing myself, but I assume I'm there. So thanks again for inviting me to participate in this in this discussion. And I'm happy also to present from the perspective of the Caribbean region that's also significantly experiencing the effects of climate change. One of the things I wanted to start about discussing is, if you've not visited the region, surely you know of how important tourism is to the economies of the islands. In relation to climate change, our recent State of the Caribbean Climate report revealed that, for example, resort properties will be destroyed by up to 60%, and our beaches will retreat inland at 100 times the rate of sea level rise. So when you think of this change that's happening on our coastline, and this is within the context of a myriad of other issues that are impacting the coastline. You can see that in general, the coastline in the Caribbean is really threatened. So many of our critical infrastructure in the coastal zone and subjected to climate stressors. This is the case for our heritage sites. I want to just start to highlight by the fact that coastal erosion and tropical cyclones and storm surges, coastal inundation are some of our primary stressors that we're having to deal with. When you go to the first slide, please, or next slide, I just want to highlight that some of our historic towns are being impacted by these issues. We have to think about the fact that persons are visiting these sites, and what are the issues that we will have to deal with moving forward. This is a case of Georgetown, Guyana, which is below sea level. And this is also the case with quite a few of our historic towns that are also welcoming visitors. Next slide, please. The first slide is of Falmouth in Jamaica, which is on the northern coast of Jamaica, that's experiencing significant flooding events. The tourists have made it a fun activity in the town, but it's a really critical thing because it's a town that we have a lot of Georgian architecture, and with these increased flooding events, and we've had instances where persons have been trapped in places sometimes as a result of flooding events. I also wanted to highlight the other picture on the slide, which is of our historic one of our historic burial spaces that has burials from the 1700s. And you can see that this site is, some of the historic graves are already submerged. And these are some of the issues that we're contended with in the region. I'm going to be highlighting a couple of sites as my case study, and just to really bring the situation home in relation to the Caribbean. And then talk about the management issues at the end. So next slide, please. So the first site I wanted to mention is Nelson's Dockyard, which is a site in Antigua and Barbuda, and a site that is very important to the economy of Antigua and Barbuda. And the site manager is here, so if you want to direct questions to him, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them. But you can see the areas where they have identified high-risk flood areas in the site. The picture in the inset is of a flooding event that they were experiencing at the site recently. And these events are becoming much more pronounced, just like how the projections for hurricanes are that they will become more intense. The flooding, the erratic flooding or flash flooding that we're seeing in some of our heritage spaces is increasing. And so if we're not thinking about these issues now, we need to be thinking about them for the future, certainly. Next slide, please. The other site I wanted to speak to you about was, or to bring to your attention, is the Pigeon Island National Park in St. Lucia, where the site is experiencing significant erosion. They've had to close the site on, or portions of the site on numerous occasions, close it to visitors. And also with each storm event that we've experienced in the Caribbean in recent years, the historic cemetery on the property is becoming much more vulnerable. And this is also the case with a lot of our historic cemeteries, as I mentioned in the previous, in a couple of slides ago. Next slide, please. Then I wanted to highlight Port Royal in Jamaica, which is a site that perhaps many persons know because of its underwater component. It's a site that's also going up for World Heritage inscription. You can see basically the relationship with Port Royal with water. And this is something with how the Port Royal evolved as a spit and being connected to the main island of Jamaica as part of its geological history, and it's built up over time. But there's a very important water component with the site. If you're looking at the second image where you see like a little image to the left, that is where the underwater city is in relation to the land component. And next slide, please. I wanted to highlight that this is the wall, the historic wall of the old naval hospital. And this wall is experiencing significant erosion, and the wall itself protects parts of the site from wave action, storms coming in. Even though it's in a protected harbor area, there are still storm events that impact the site, and so it's important to look at these components, because sometimes we might focus on the bigger, more monumental parts of a site, even though the old naval hospital is right behind that wall. But we have to look at how smaller aspects such as this wall, the role it has to play in protecting the site, and what actions we need to put in place. The image, the fourth image, which is to my right, is of the fort of Fort Charles, which is not really impacted by climate change, so to speak, unless we continue to have significant erosion of the coast. But there's also Fort Rocky. I am not sure how clear the image is, but there's a picture of Fort Rocky at the bottom, which is another fortification that's in Port Royal, that has a very unique relationship with the sea around it, and that is a site that we will need to watch for the future. We recently did a heritage impact assessment for Port Royal, and it was revealed that the underwater city is not significantly impacted by, for example, storms. But this is something that they would have to continue to monitor, as for example, if the seabed is being turned up by storm activity. Certainly, it's something that we'll need to pay attention to for the future. The next slide is next slide, please. Yes. So this is historic Bridgetown. The image to the top shows us projections for sea level. Basically, what the flooding will look like in the coastal area of historic Bridgetown, with various scenario for sea level rise and global warming. I put the picture below next to it because many of the assets that comprise the core of historic Bridgetown are within this flooding zone. And currently, even though the site has a risk management plan as part of its management strategy, it is not it doesn't really have indicators, and there are no real actions taking place in addressing some of the issues that the site will be facing. For example, the site has been facing increased flooding events in recent years, and this has always been the case for the site. And it really brings home the point of what we need to consider in relation to what's going to happen to these sites if we're not either implementing any mitigation actions in relation to dealing with disasters, or what are we doing for adaptation moving forward. The final event on that slide is of a flooding event where the water is basically over the bridge in the town, and the projections for sea level rise in many of the islands of the Caribbean will see some of our coastal heritage really being inundated by these events. Next slide, please. The final image I wanted to show you in terms of these impacts is of the Carriacou Museum that was recently basically destroyed by Hurricane Beryl in July. Now, we tend to focus a lot on the sites as being the monuments or other attractions that are in these coastal areas, but I just wanted to bring home that we have a lot of repositories and museums that are in this coastal zone as well. You can see the entire top portion of the museum is gone. As I said, this is a reality for sites that are in the coastal zone. Next slide, please. I just wanted to end by talking about some of the issues that are the actions that some of these sites are taking in relation to. So I end with this final slide. This is Jamaica, where they're trying to do assessments in relation to what cultural institutions or attractions in their coastal zone. They started with Kingston, but it's something that they're hoping to roll out to other areas, key areas, just to see what's where and what actions need to be done. What's in a flood zone, for example, and what are the actions that need to be taken. Moving to Trinidad and Tobago, another action is in relation to, they recently had a project, Resilient Trinidad and Tobago, and Nelson's Island was a part of that study, and they were able to determine how the site was going to be impacted by sea level rise and erosion moving forward. And so they've started to incorporate elements of that study into the interpretation of the site and how they communicate with visitors at the site. If we should go back to Nelson's Dockyard, for example, they were looking at what elements of the site they could elevate in order to better protect some spaces in relation to flooding events. They're also starting to undertake restoration work in some of the fortifications that are part of the site. These things they cost money, and unfortunately, we in the region we're still struggling with issues to do with disaster risk management planning or in addressing some of the stressors that we know we're facing in relation to climate change. In the past, what has happened is that sometimes sites have been closed if they have been significantly impacted, and they're reopened as soon as they're able to undertake some maintenance work. In some sites, we have sites that have not been even restored since years past, and I can think of Grenada or St. George's Grenada, where many sites are still, for example, without their roofs. Historic sites are still without their roofs, and so these are issues that require resources for us. And sometimes because of the low priority that is being accorded to the heritage sector, these actions are not prioritized. One final point I wanted to make in relation to Barbados, and well, this is not really only for Barbados, but more and more in towns, and this will benefit historic towns. They're trying to install sea defense boulders as one way of protecting the coastline. We know there are many issues that that come up with our engineering solutions, hard engineering solutions sometimes. But this is one thing that they're using to protect some of the coastline in the historic areas. And a final point I wanted to make is in relation to Barbados. The physical development plan for Barbados has the updated plan has in place that a climate risk study should be done for heritage in Barbados to determine what actions need to be taken. And I think this is an important step that that is being taken by one of our islands, because this is something that's not really being done across the region. We're still caught up in responding to issues sometimes instead of being very proactive. Of course, it takes resources to be very proactive sometimes, and as I mentioned before, this is lacking. But they are trying to identify the areas that are at risk based on different stressors, and trying to see what actions they need to put in place there. Also, in Barbados, they have integrated elements of the culture sector in their disaster risk management plan programming for the country at the country level. So if we have more actions like these, I'm certain that we can start to tackle and move from merely thinking about how sites are being impacted to implementing the studies that are needed, and to really move forward to making evidence-based or taking evidence-based actions to better protect our heritage that's in our coastal areas. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. That's fantastic. And it's so nice as well to get a very varied and broad survey of all of the different challenges that we're seeing across, or many of the different challenges across the Caribbean, as well as a real sort of variety and contrast with all of those. So thank you very much for giving us a real sort of insights from those different case studies. That's really, really fantastic. So look, we've got a little bit of time now for some questions, so let's do that. I'm just having a look and seeing, I think we have a question from perhaps Chris Waters. And I've also just been having a look at all the people shouting out to say where they're from, which is fantastic. We've got a lot from Norway and the Faroe Isles, which is really interesting. There's obviously a clear link there with some of the issues that we've been looking at in terms of commonalities. But we have already a question from Chris Waters, and I think maybe this is to Will. Is there a consideration for visitor surcharging and or limiting visitation per day? I guess that means to Stafford and Lunga, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah,
very quickly. Yes, I mean we've definitely considered not necessarily a surcharge, but some sort of contribution, and even £1 per person on a boat would bring in, maybe up to £100,000 a year on Stafford, which we really, really need right now. So yes, we definitely considered it. We have discussed it with the boat operators. They don't like it, as you can imagine, but we are reaching a point now where we have to be insistent on that. It's quite complicated because you can only, because of Scottish access laws, people have a right to go to places, and you can't really charge them to go to places, but we can charge for use of the infrastructure, the jetty. So we would do it on that sort of basis, and that it would be a contribution towards management and maintenance of the island, as opposed to an access fee kind of thing. And limiting numbers, where do you draw the line? That's the difficulty. And we have, that's been considered as well because of the impacts on the birds. But actually, the counter to that as well, of course, is people being able to see puffins and things means they're likely to care for them more as well. So that's an important aspect of it for us. But yeah, where do you draw the line? If you do limit numbers, how? That's the question.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. I just see there's a follow-on comment there. I think this is Patricia Lucas Peterson. We'll just take this and then we'll move into the discussion. But Patricia asks, in the Faroes, or she says, here in the Faroes, we've now started charging to hike where the puffins are, and there are guided tours so people could not get too close to the puffins' nests. We also closed 1 week a year in April for repair of tourist areas. I don't know if you want to have a comment on that briefly. Will?
Yeah, well, we've now got. Oh, sorry, yeah, is that right? We've got rangers on Stafford and Lunga now, and they do exactly that. They explain to visitors, and that's been really, really effective. So they don't do guided tours, but they're just there on hand, and they're visible, and they chat to people, and it's very low key, but it's really, really made a big difference. And the rope around the puffin colony as well has made a big difference, and it's pinned to the ground. It's not sort of in your face, and it really works. So that's been great. But yeah, closing for a month sounds like a good plan as well.
Indeed. And I know we're pressed for time, but just maybe to broaden things out a little bit and to see perhaps if any of the speakers would like to come back on this particular question. This is Rob Woodside, who's the Conservation Director at English Heritage. Do heritage sites need to have a strong economic tourism value to justify their protection? I don't know if any of the panel want to address that particular comment. I'll say it again. Do heritage sites need to have a strong economic tourism value to justify their protection? Any comments on that one from the panel, from any of the panel?
I'll maybe make a quick comment. So I would say no. And I'm only going to say this from a geological heritage perspective, because that's my area of expertise. So many of our geological heritage sites in Northern Ireland are protected. They were identified as part of the Earth Science Conservation Review Programme, which is the same as the Geoconservation Review in GB. The vast majority of those are not tourist sites. So they are protected, but they make up 95% of our geological heritage in Northern Ireland. It's only the big hitters, the iconic sites like the Giant's Causeway, or for example, parts of the Ring of Gallion in County Down, Armagh, that would have the tourism value, as it were. So we try and keep the rest of them secret.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, very good.
And
Thank
I
you.
agree with Andrea. It's
Good.
like it's not necessary, but unfortunately that is often the case.
Yeah. I think that sums it up.
Yeah, very, very good. Okay, excellent. Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers again. Some really insightful presentations and excellent range of case studies. A real breadth, actually, that we've covered. I mean, I would say it's very stimulating as well as perhaps a little exhausting to go on almost a trip of so many different examples. So thank you again, to each of Stephanie, of course, Will, Kirstin, and of course Andrea. That's really, really fantastic. So what we'll do now, we have about 15 minutes or so. We'll break into small breakout rooms to discuss how the speakers we've been hearing from today have challenged our thinking and approaches to conservation of coastal heritage particularly. These questions here we'll post again in the breakout rooms when we do that. What I would say is that actually it is during these discussions that quite often we make the most meaningful and useful connections that we do in this whole set of workshops. So if you're able to, please stick around and have these conversations as we take part in those discussions. So in a moment, Kira will send us out into the rooms, and then we'll come back together again just before 5:30 GMT, and we'll have a very brief roundup. I would just say, just before we break out, there will be a link to a Padlet board in each of those discussion rooms, and if you can type some notes, either one person or if anyone wants to do it, feel free to do that, so that we can capture some of the key points of those discussions, because they are exceptionally valuable. That would be brilliant. All right, so we'll break out into the groups, and then we'll come back together again just for 5:30. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I think we're more or less back now. We'll wait for a sort of a bit of a trickle coming in, so we'll see. But we might as well start with the roundup then of what we've discussed. And it's good to see that we had a good number of people talking. So again, just thinking about these questions here about today's speakers, if they challenged your thinking, or if there was anything actually that really stood out in what you were talking about. Our own group one, we were talking about a few different things about the variety of approaches and what is the correct approach, particularly if you've got, for example, a situation of perhaps mosaics that are in danger. Do you protect them so that people can visit them? Do you gain access, or do you preserve them other ways, perhaps digitally, and accept the fact that change happens, for example? That's something that we were looking at, as well as perhaps other ways of documentation and thinking about creating maybe research centres to perhaps cope with that type of approach, which has been a very, very useful thing. And then the question of how to keep visitors coming, while this was a particular Caribbean example, how to keep visitors coming while you've already got a lot of a challenge, let's say, from disaster response and relief that's going on at the same time. So it's a big challenge, a big dilemma there, perhaps, in terms of what they're seeing. I don't know if Chris has rejoined us. He might want to pick up on that a little bit to make that point even stronger. But I think that was pretty much it. But yes, any other comments then from any of the other groups in terms of what you were discussing? It'd be really good to hear a little bit more. Feel free to just go for it.
Rob, do you want to talk a little bit about the valuing discussion we were having?
Okay. Can you hear me, Alex?
Yes, can hear you. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah. Well, I just picked up on that question I put about do you need to have an economic value or a high tourism value to really focus where you put coastal defences? And obviously, the first feedback was no, you don't. But it's kind of what happens, and we explored that a bit further. Great, we had Georgia Butters in the group, who's my colleague, who looks after Tintagel Castle in Cornwall, which is economically really important for the English heritage. But also, we didn't touch on this, Georgia, but imagine there's a pretty big wider economic value of that in the community, and just that sort of the multiplier of spend and the rest of it when you work in that part of the world. But it's the debate about where, if when push comes to shove, where do you really feel that you can put defences? If you can put defences in, if that's the right thing to do, because what do you protect? What value are you protecting there? Are you protecting the heritage value of the site because it's so important that you won't want to lose it, or are you protecting it because there's an economic or broader social value to it as well? And then Heather brilliantly brought in lots of discussion about the intangible heritage of sites as well, and thinking that we can be very focused on the sort of physical aspects of heritage or all the sort of tourism bit, but then that intangible bit, which is so rooted in different cultures and different people's understanding about place and relationship with land and nature and the world, it's also a really important dimension as well. So I think it comes back to part of some of the conversation where we started Coastal Connections is, why does this matter? Who does this matter to? And if we can't define why it all matters, then it'll all become you can't win the argument for either sort of making adjustments or investments or what have you. So we've got to be able to be clear in terms of what do we mean by, when we look at all these different aspects, what do we mean by value, and how do we recognize the economics as so important to it, but also see beyond that to feel about the wider benefits that caring for coastal heritage really brings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, a key part of that is how we articulate some of that value, and obviously give voice to particularly the community voices and so on that are looking to see the value of their heritage, their local heritage, perhaps, conserved beyond obviously the need to meet those economic, gains as well, even though they are symbiotic in many ways for those communities to thrive and survive in many ways. So I think that's really important. But yeah, fantastic. Just say as well, thanks for that, Rob, and for everyone who's fed back actually in both groups. What we will do, obviously, there will be time as well for you to add more notes to the Padlets that we've got. So the Padlet board that's set up for this workshop, for this discussion. If there are some notes that you want to put up, any of the key points that were made in those discussions, feel free to add. That will be up and remain up for some time. So don't feel you have to scribble around too much. But maybe while it's fresh in the mind, put something on there. That'd be really helpful. So thanks very much indeed, everyone. It's been fantastic again, as usual. And again, it's really nice to see such a broad range of examples, not just the speakers, but actually a broad range of people from different sites we've had represented today coming to the workshop to join us. So thanks to all the speakers, all of those that took part in the discussions and helped them along, and particularly my colleague Kira, who's helped again to sort out the technical side of things. That's been really useful. The recording of the workshop will be there alongside the others. The others are all now up, which is great. You can have a look at those. And also, again, we're developing, as usual, the range of fact sheets that we've been working on. And again, here's Hurst Castle. We've also had Venice and a few others. But this is a crucial part of the outputs of Coastal Connections that we're developing, a real library, a compendium of case studies, and really case studies at the heart of what we're doing with Coastal Connections in terms of the sharing of expertise about challenges and how to address those. And, you know, an honesty about the solutions that are being adopted. That's something really important and crucial to those, and they will be accessible. So if you want to get in touch with us about co-producing one of these with us, then fantastic, please do that. That would be great. They tend to be focused on particular sites, so particular case study sites. That would be great. Please do get in touch. And just to say, the last thing really is that the next workshop we've got, which will be on the 12th December, slightly later, starting at 5 p.m. GMT, because we've got a speaker, at least one from New Zealand, which will be great. So we'll also have Malta and the UK and some others, which will be great. But that will be looking at assessing risk and vulnerability to coastal heritage. So there'll be a range of perspectives for us to have a look at there. Different scales from how you deal with risk and vulnerability at broader scale, perhaps national scale, right down to site level scale as well. So that'll be useful. So then I look forward to seeing you all again then. But thanks very much indeed in the meantime, and have a good week, a good month, and take care. Thanks a lot. See you next time.